Hello, good evening. It's great to see all of you. I'm Karen Wolf, and I'm the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the annual Bromsen Lecture. So my colleague, Jose Montelongo, will introduce this year's speaker, Kris in just a moment, but first I wanted to share a few comments about Maury Bromsen, for whom this annual lecture is named. So this evening, almost 2 decades after his passing, we celebrate Maury's commitment to the JCB and indeed to Latin Americana with this annual lecture. Maury Bromsen was a book dealer, a collector, and a lover and scholar of Latin American books. He was honorary curator and bibliographer of Latin Americana here at the JCB. In the late 1990s, he donated to the library a really remarkable collection of books and manuscripts, as well as a collection of materials associated with Simón Bolívar. Maury was also a great benefactor to the library in other ways, endowing the position of the Bromsen Curator of Latin American Books, this lecture, fellowships, and more. The JCB inaugurated the Bromsen Room, which is just over there in the corner, in 2000, where we have a representative sample of Maury's Bolívar collection. For a full exhibit experience of the Bolívar materials, you can visit a virtual exhibit online. In the Bromsen Room, in fact, this is a bit of a twofer tonight. I don't know if all of you knew this was a twofer night, but it is. In addition to this marvelous lecture from Kris that you're going to hear in just a moment, we actually have opened, we're not really cutting ribbons exactly, but we've just opened the door on a brand new exhibit curated by Dr. Bertie Mandelblatt, the George S. Parker Curator of Maps and Prints here at the JCB. Learning to Sail, Living at Sea, Vernaculars of Transatlantic Knowledge, explores the traces left in manuscript and printed records by a diverse range of people who crossed the Atlantic Ocean, vulnerable to the volatility and the incredible violence inherent in European-led maritime activity in the colonial period. And we hope that you'll take a chance to visit the exhibit during the reception. No food and drinks in there, please. Somebody will be watching. Anyway, indeed, this lecture finds us squarely in the middle of our fall programming here at the JCB, which has featured a variety of programs, including the launch of the Race and Regency Lab, a new initiative directed by Professor Patricia Matthew at Montclair State, and just last week, a lecture as part of the Southwest Seminar on interdisciplinary approaches to colonialism in Latin America. And tomorrow, we're going to feature a discussion with Kris's colleague, Timothy Johnson, on the process of translating primary materials. And next week, we're going to host the keynote lecture and reception for the Scientia, I always mess up that word, conference on the global history of knowledge. We're really delighted to be doing that, despite my horrible bungling of the Latin there. We're committed also here at the JCB, in addition to multilingualism, which I cannot master, to accessibility, which means that as many of these events as possible will be produced in a hybrid format, just like tonight. So while we're so happy to have all of you here in the reading room, we're also so happy to have those of you who are joining us online with us. We also want you to come back again and again for these exhibits, talks, workshops, and to be part of the JCB's activities in person and online. And now I'd like to turn the mic over to my colleague, the Maury Bromsen Curator of Latin American Books, Dr. Jose Montelongo.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, JCB Fellows, members of the Board of Governors, people from Brown, students from Brown, and people from Providence. I want to start by making a public announcement. If you are trying to convince a high school student or a first-year student in college to stay away from the humanities and go into a more lucrative career, then you must hide from them the books of Kris. Because I'm going to show you a few. In fact, if you are watching this on Zoom and you have such a high schooler at home with you, hurry up and cover their ears, because what I'm about to tell you would put those people at risk of choosing to major in history, to the dismay of family members. Now, imagine a book that is a sort of experiment in global history by way of luxury commodities. I am quoting Kris here. A book that examines the mining, exchange, and consumption of Colombian emeralds from the early 16th to the late 18th centuries. Colombian emeralds, still quoting Kris here, were greatly esteemed by Habsburg and other European princes as gems and objects of scientific curiosity. Throughout Christian Europe, faceted, rounded, and tumbled emeralds were incorporated into crowns, rings, religious ornaments, and other jeweled artifacts. Some extraordinary crystals were showcased in wonder cabinets alongside Native American featherworks and other marvels. And yet, the largest stones produced in early modern Colombia soon found their outlet not in Europe or in the Americas, or even China, destination of much New World silver, but in South and Southwestern Asia, where they were consumed, hoarded, ritually exchanged, and pillaged by the rulers of the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires. The book is titled Color of Paradise, with a U, because it was published in England in 2010. So then you would show the poor victim then you would show them the image of this dagger made for the Sultan Mahmud I in 1746, with those 3 magnificent emeralds on the hilt and 1 more in the scabbard. Is the victim properly mesmerized? Not yet. Tell them then that Kris also wrote a book about the Cerro Rico de Potosí, the rich hill, also now known as the Red Mountain. This mountain, in present-day Bolivia, at almost 16,000 feet, produced about half of the world's silver during the century after its discovery in 1545. The name Potosí spread around the world, and the Spanish expression vale un Potosí still refers to immense riches. Potosí, and I'm quoting Kris again, has always been a site of struggle and innovation, a dense concentration of predictable losses and unpredictable successes, an indigenous space and also a complex African and European one, a woman-centered world in spite of men's best efforts. Potosí, the Silver City that changed the world, was published in 2019. Now, Kris, let me peek into the mind of a historian for a second. You must have thought, I've got the emeralds, I've got the silver. What kind of people wanted emeralds and silver very, very eagerly, ardently, violently? You probably thought, pirates. I should write about pirates. Sorry to disappoint you guys, but Kris did write a book about pirates. He did it, but since history is not linear, he did it before the emeralds and the silver. Back in 1998, there is an augmented, improved edition from the year 2016, Pillaging the Empire. I'm close to the end here. He also published in 2002 a fascinating book titled Quito in 1599, back when he was professor in the Department of History at the College of William and Mary. In this book, he starts with the story of this incredible painting that is the cover of the book. In this book, he tells overlapping stories of civil disturbance, shipwrecks, indigenous uprising, pirate attacks, maroon intransigence, urban decadence, failed missionary endeavors, and sharp economic reorientations. Kris Lane currently holds the Franz V. Scholes Chair in Colonial Latin American History in Tulane University. He is the author of Pandemic in Potosí, Fear, Loathing, and Public Piety in a Colonial Mining Metropolis from 2021, a book that offers an introduction to a deadly Pan-Andean disease that swept from Buenos Aires to Lima between the years 1717 and 1792. He will tell us about his new project in today's lecture. Welcome, Kris, and thank you for being with us tonight. This evening.
Wow. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for the generous invitation and for that really literary introduction. I hope I can live up to it. It's really great to be back here. Thank you all for coming out. I was a fellow here in 2006, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that same log was in the fireplace. Not sure, but I think so. But the place has otherwise been transformed, thanks in part to Karen's efforts to really open it up, make it a more welcoming place, and to have sun streaming in the evening at a talk. It's unbelievable. It's an honor to be here in Providence to deliver the Mari Bromsen Memorial Lecture. We owe him profound thanks. I did not overlap with him, but I have definitely benefited, as I think all of you have, and all researchers who come here have, with his generous gift. And I want to mention, before I forget, that Simón Bolívar was of Basque ancestry, and I'm going to be talking about Basques this evening. I've been invited to share thoughts on current work, but I'd also like to touch on the vital and continued importance of the research library, and not just to historians, but to other scholars who go beyond the boundaries of my discipline. I need not try to convince this audience that the JCB is unique among such institutions. At least as long as we are in this building, the Americas are one. History is contested, but safe, in the sense that we share certain convictions about evidence, an honest argument. My talk happens to coincide with publication of a new book called Basques and Vicuñas at the Mouth of Hell, a documentary history of Potosí in the early 1620s. And it's literally hot off the press. This may seem like a narrow topic compared to emeralds in the global sphere or piracy, but I hope to convince you otherwise. This is a book about the pressing and current problem of historical truth. You might say the Rashomon effect meets fake news by way of a cauldron of hot emotion. It's a story about spin in the age before newspapers, and also about translation. My friend and translator, Tim Johnson, who is here in front, he and I will discuss tomorrow some of the problems of translating 17th century Spanish voices for a modern audience. I hope some of you can join us. The story of early 1620s Potosí has a close Brown University Library connection, which I'll get to shortly. It's not a story of the JCB, which I can only lamely apologize for. It's about the hay. But you could do worse than have two dueling research libraries within a stone's throw of one another. One can only hope that no interlibrary civil war breaks out in the green. What I'd like to do first is reflect on what I'm calling Indiano tales not Indiana Jones, but Indiano tales, which the John Carter Brown Library possesses a great many across a dozen genres. I'll stick to text in Spanish, saying only a word or two about a few items that I consulted while here at the John Carter Brown Library on a fellowship some years back. These imperial texts, as I'm calling them, composed by mostly Iberian immigrants, demand context, and I'm only offering a fast and loose sketch, using New Granada and then Greater Peru, and finally the Indies, before we turn to Potosí in the Bolivian Andes. Here I list several genres and their basic aims. I argue that many Indiano authors struggled to create the impression of empire, of control of lands, waters, peoples, of souls, of hearts and minds that they could not possibly control, that neither Spain nor any other foreign interloper could control. This book, known to scholars as La Milicia Indiana, or the Indian Militia, exemplifies the blend of imperial expectation and failure, of disappointment, shortcomings. Bernardo de Vargas Machuca was a late arriving, failed conquistador, and his absurd ambition, not for one more, but four, speaks volumes. A la espada y el compás, más y más y más y más. Vargas Machuca was an Indiano with a tale to tell, or rather, several tales to tell. He saw himself as the model paramilitary captain, leader of the inevitable counterinsurgency, a colonial cleanup artist. And yet he could only imagine doing this by learning day to day from the so-called Indians, they who actually knew how to set traps for men like him, how to cure snake bites, how to march for days through the jungle without so much as a wad of coca in their mouths. The Indian militia turns out to be, unexpectedly, very much an indigenous story. There were other ways to make grand imperial claims despite living in a mountain fastness, a semi-Hispanic enclave surrounded by unconquered peoples. And this was the typical Spanish experience in the Americas: Bogota, Quito, Mexico City, Guatemala, Antigua. Juan de Castellanos played the role of Indiano epic poet from such a mountain fastness. His work was intended to memorialize past heroes, but also to spur his seemingly less devoted followers and peers to finish the job of conquest. This was aspirational writing. Castellanos was a cleric, and he would soon be followed by hagiographers who would chronicle the so-called spiritual conquest, a term that came into vogue in the early 17th century, populating the Indies, west and east, with martyrs and saints. Conquest was always unfinished business and bloody, rife with sacrifice. Another cleric historian was Fray Pedro Simón, who followed Castellanos and Vargas Machuca, also based in New Granada, today's Colombia, and whose Noticias Historiales used the idea of historical news or tidings from the vastness of New Granada to repackage conquest as divine revelation. That is, the unfolding of human history in the Americas revealed divine will. God willed the Spanish Empire this burden. The imperial narrative grandstanding, with its preacherly asides and admonishments, was then joined by the codification of colonial law, the laws of the Indies. Here, the Indiano Juan de Solórzano Pereira sought to corral a chaotic mess of legislation and decrees in order to rationally rule this vast early American space that the Habsburg monarchs of Spain so presumptuously claimed. Again, we see the illusion of control, of conquest completion, As James Muldoon, long a JCB fixture, many of you will remember James, he explained that Solórzano's Politica Indiana was a medieval imperial dream to be realized, a creation as fantastic as this frontispiece. What came next were Creole counterpoints, but for now we'll stick to Indiano tales from a different space, the Cerro Rico and imperial villa of Potosí in today's Bolivia. Perched in the Andes at over 13,000 feet above sea level and almost equidistant from Lima and Buenos Aires, Potosí was a truly cosmopolitan city by the turn of the 17th century. There were numerous indigenous groups in and about town speaking half a dozen or more indigenous languages, plus a growing number of multilingual Africans. As you can see from this image from notary records, many of them bearing their country marks as well as European brands. Europeans came from all over. We have reference of 3 young men from Bergen, Norway, arriving in Potosí in 1610. What were they doing? We have no idea. Looking for silver, I presume. Potosí's population swelled to well over 100,000 by 1600, and as many as 150,000, we think, by 1640. The silver mines and associated mills were dependent on an extensive labor draft known as the mita, or turn in Quechua. And that mita encompassed these districts that you see in the map on the left, almost to Cusco in the north, into northern Argentina in the south, indigenous people drafted to work in the mines and mills. Footloose migrants, most of them Indianos, that is, coming from Spain, also flooded the imperial villa, often armed. They were called loosely soldados, soldiers of fortune. A rare sketch of the city and Cerro Rico from the early 1630s includes men with muskets and mounties with broad-brimmed hats, possibly made from felted vicuña wool, hence the term vicuñas, a wild relative of the llama. This was the Old West, but in South America, a super high-altitude deadwood. Veterans of many foreign wars, Spanish soldiers had a reputation for mayhem, whether in Europe or in the Philippines. Potosí drew many young armed migrants with its famous scent of silver. Touchy about status, full of bravado, some were quick to kill. Could their violent energies be harnessed and directed? Potosí's extraordinary wealth drew in a constant stream of Iberians, from Portuguese and Galicians to Extremadurans and Andalusians. La Mancha and Old Castile were also well represented, as was the Basque Country. Mountaineers, or montañeses, hailed from Cantabria and Asturias. Fewer migrants came from the Kingdom of Aragon, although we find some notable Catalans involved in the dispute. A new class of elites had emerged in boomtown Potosí, the Mercury men, or azogueros, from the Spanish term azogue, an old term derived from the Arabic for mercury, al-azuk. Some were descendants of conquistadors, but most were recent migrants from Spain, and Basques were very well represented among the azogueros. Nearly all the Mercury men were deeply in debt, in fact, drowning in it when all hell broke loose. The great machine of Potosí, as it was described by visitors, La Máquina, relied on a vast hinterland for everything from food to fuel, mercury, all the reagents, everything that could be eaten or drunk, the wine. The Spanish Empire or Hispanic monarchy relied on the proper functioning of this great machine. And so we have a lot of correspondence between local officials and the crown, Potosí is the jewel of the empire, and therefore very closely connected despite the great distances. The footloose soldiers then were a wild card, a potential monkey wrench in the great machine that might jam the wheels. The beating heart of Potosí was made up of 100 or so ingenios, or engines, to crush silver ore. This one was designed by a major Basque industrialist named Sancho de Madariaga, and I used a verbal description that he left behind and then drew a sketch and sent to a professional artist to try to render all of these things that we were reading about and trying to imagine. Madariaga would play a role in the 1620s Civil War, and soldado attacks on his ingenio were a serious problem with sabotage. This is what it was all about. Basque merchants and moneylenders were also prominent, among them Lorenzo de Ariola, who drowned with these silver bars and coins in a 1622 shipwreck off the coast of Florida in a hurricane. The flow of Potosí silver to Spain was vital to empire, as was the flow of silver to Manila to defend and to trade with China. The Basque Vicuña conflict broke out in June 1622 as the Cerro Rico's mines dove deep, indigenous worker numbers dropped, and the overall cost of production rose. It was a crisis. Prospectors scoured the hinterland for new Potosís, one of which appeared at Oruro. Here's a quick chronology of the so-called Basque Vicuña War. I won't dwell on any details, just to say that things had been brewing for some time, and the spark is lit, or the fire is lit on 8 June 1622 with a particular murder of a Basque tough named San Juan de Urbieta. And this leads to street fighting, mutual ambushes, attacks, burning of houses, all sorts of violent things going on, and finally the attack on the corregidor, or the governor's house, which leads to a whole new problem, and the mustering of a militia, a new corregidor, a new governor. All of this is finally stopped by a viceregal amnesty. The viceroy decides to just put a lid on it rather than allowing for people to litigate. And then Potosí is hit with a flood right after the violence stops and the rumbling continues. Even before the smoke cleared or the dust settled, eyewitnesses began composing instant histories, all of them partisan, but all of them claiming to be neutral. Here are the first two that Tim Johnson and I collected and translated, one at the British Library and one at the New York Public Library. The one on the right was not even in the catalog. It was accidentally brought to me when I was in the reading room. And I said, where did this come from? I think I know what this is. I know the story. I assumed that someone had published on it. I talked to everybody I could, and they said, nope, never heard of it. It turns out to be the fullest, longest narrative account of this event, and so it's the kind of showpiece. And then we found that the Basques were, I'm sorry, the image is kind of covering up some of the words there, but the Basques took refuge in the Augustinian monastery where they had a confraternity to Our Lady of Arantzazu. Those of you who've been to Gipuzkoa know where this is and how important it is to Basque identity. But all of their prayers to the Virgin could not save them, and they were thus moved off to the city of La Plata, about 100 miles away, what's today Sucre, Bolivia. The Basques composed their own instant histories, mostly in the form of long letters sent home to Vizcaya and Gipuzkoa. They went over the head of the viceroy because they could see he wasn't going to help them. And we included a number of these accounts that we found in Basque archives and also in Madrid, which offer quite distinct points of view. It so happened that Potosí's Basque-Vicuña War broke out at the start of King Philip IV's reign. He was still a youth. He'd only come into power in 1622, 1621, 1622. His prime minister, or valido, soon to hold the title Count Duke of Olivares, was intolerant of nationalism, these factions among Spanish nations or ethnic groups, as he had experienced it firsthand while a graduate student at the University of Salamanca. He all but ignored the Basque pleas for assistance. Meanwhile, Peru's Viceroy Guadalcázar ordered creation of a citizen militia to keep peace in Potosí, and the muster roll survives in the Potosí Municipal Archives. We offer snippets of the muster roll in our account since the militia was seen as highly controversial, both because of its cost and because its formation suggested that the imperial villa was not imperial at all. It was a hotbed of anti-imperial sedition. What makes the muster roll so vital to us is its physical descriptions of hapless musketeers, the people who got drafted to serve. Among them was a lone Irishman, plus a few Basques who weren't supposed to serve. The Irishman just wasn't supposed to be there. They described him as small, bald, and red-haired, with a pointy chin. The militia proved worthless, only seeming to provoke Vicuña aggression, and thus it was unceremoniously disbanded. After a few more skirmishes and rural ambushes, the whole conflict ended with the 1625 viceregal amnesty, which satisfied no one, and festering tensions would enable new kinds of troubles, including the great Potosí mint fraud, which I'm now writing about. The competing narratives and other evidence all put the historian on the defensive, trying to explain. Bolivian historians Gunnar Mendoza and Alberto Crespo tried to disentangle this story back in the 1950s, and they came to very different conclusions. Both suggested that the fighting concealed deeper structural misalignments, but was this a case of Basque capitalists versus Vicuña proletarians, as Crespo claimed? Here is where Brown University enters the picture at last. Some of you may recall the 1975 book, Tales of Potosí. R.C. Padden, who was in the history department, if I recall correctly, put this together along with Francis Lopez Morillas, the translator. But Padden was drawing from the great big book of Potosí that had frustrated Alberto Crespo and fascinated Gunnar Mendoza, along with his friend Louis Hankey, the wide-ranging US-based Latin Americanist. Doing research for the Library of Congress Hispanic Division in the 1930s, Hankey came across a manuscript copy of this history of Potosí by a man calling himself Bartolomé Arsanz de Ursúa y Vela. He was a Creole writer from the early 18th century, born in Potosí, and his aim was to make sense of why his great hometown had fallen on such hard times. Hankey then discovered that the only other known copy of Arsanz's manuscript was held by Brown's Hay Library. With Mendoza, Hankey produced this handsome 3-volume set, plus the English introductory overview. Can you imagine there was a Brown University press with an imprint in Mexico City? Arsanz cast the history of Potosí as a cosmic drama, its chronological progression as a series of divine punishments. There were 3, of which the Basque-Vicuña conflict was number 1. Strike 1. Eventually, Arsanz, as he was writing, lived through Strike 4, the plague that was mentioned in the introduction in the early 1700s. Arsanz treats the Basque-Vicuña conflict in excruciating detail because it constituted the first great punishment that destroyed his favorite city. Factionalism was an old Iberian obsession. Arsanz was translating, trying to make Potosí familiar for an Iberian audience. Some would say to make it medieval. When reading Arsance's account of the Civil War, we discover how much he seems to rely on the anti-Basque narratives that were available to him. And he cites a number of these, many of which he seems to have made up, that seem absolutely false. This is what upset Alberto Crespo, the Bolivian historian, when he was trying to use Arsance as a source. He's like, I can't trust him on anything. Gunnar Mendoza said, oh, but this is great literature. This is a Baroque treasure. Louis Hankey joined him in saying, yes, we must publish this thing. It's too crazy. Mendoza then spent a long time trying to find all of these narratives, of which we ended up, Tim and I, putting together a collection and trying to put them in one place. So it led us to our project, inspired us after our own archival discoveries. We're essentially putting a set of competing Indiano tales out to rekindle interest in the truth about 17th century Potosí's crisis and decline, but also to spark debate about the nature of historical evidence and how it informs or fails to inform canonical texts. We trust Arsance, the Creole counterpoint historian, at our peril, and yet his narrative must not be ignored. We must ask, what was he trying to say and to whom? He wrote 1 million words. He had a lot to say. Here in our beloved archives and research libraries, we work with texts out of context, with artifacts, but without authors, or with authors whose lives remain mostly opaque to us. We struggle to imagine lost worlds, their worlds, or the worlds they too were struggling to imagine or make sense of, to make legible to others. Our Indiano and Creole tellers of tales told long tales at times, and sometimes they hove close to the truth. Our clearest windows on this thing we call vast early America are their works, to which we add archival traces, plus a crude image or two, some historical archaeology, if we're fortunate, museum-quality artifacts, materials. Yet these worlds, these imaginary empires, recede from us even as they push forth or assert themselves by way of startlingly resilient texts, like the oddball Indian militia. We search for elusive women in text and archive, for indigenous, African, and other subaltern voices. They are there in the interstices of our narratives, our tall tales, but we strain our ears, read against the grain. At times we hear them, if faintly. At times their actions, as reported by others, all but shout. Each text hides a chorus, conceals a context. Long ago, Borderlands historian Herbert Eugene Bolton called for the study of Greater America, a reflection perhaps of optimistic times or of his own optimistic personality. That project has been slow to catch on and easy to criticize. But whatever you may think of Bolton, I can safely say that inasmuch as the Inter-American Project has succeeded, it has been thanks in no small part to the visionary leadership that has shaped and continues to shape the John Carter Brown Library. Vast early America is but another incarnation of this hemispheric hope, the hope for mutual understanding. Thank you.
We have time for questions, 15, almost 20 minutes perhaps. Anybody, and we will take from some online. I will gladly start with a quick one. I mean, the answer will depend more on Kris. Kris, I'd like to ask you if you could give us a quick sensory walkthrough Potosí, 1620 or 1600, whenever you want, but how did it, what were the sounds that you heard near these mills? What were the smells that you imagine or that you found in the sources? How did the mountain look at night, for instance? What were people chewing or eating? That is the question.
Well, I'm going to take a little flight then of imagination based on a wide variety of eyewitness descriptions, along with the kind of material that shows up in notary books, which gives us a sense of what people were chewing and eating and drinking and spitting, how they were feeling. Potosí was potentially the first industrial extractive site of scale on Earth. That is, there were places in Europe, places in China, probably some in South Asia where extraction of minerals was being done on a significant scale, but nothing like Potosí. Everyone who visited, who'd been to someplace else, said, this is unique. First of all, I can't breathe because I'm so far above sea level. They didn't know exactly what was going on, but they knew that they weren't feeling well. And someone would thrust coca leaves into their hands and say, chew on this. Maybe it'll make your headache go away and you'll be able to breathe a little bit better. But Potosí was a punishing place. It's very cold at night. It's not very hot during the day, but the sun burns you. They have a joke in Spanish there. El sol aquí te quema, pero no se calenta. The sun here burns you, but never warms you up. And so it's a place that, even for indigenous people, was difficult. The altitude, the hard work, climbing the mountain, going underground, and it's a 24/7 place. So that's why I say it's one of the earliest industrial sites. The mills ran all night and all day, as long as there was water. And water was collected in a series of significantly distant reservoirs with a canal business connecting them to the city to supply power for these mills. And so the whole thing was described as a machine in part like that because it was like, oh, it's always smoky. It's always dusty. It's always loud. It's loud all night long. And the rhythm of the place was distinct from everything around. And if you go there even today, it's like it's really in the middle of nowhere. So you cross these high deserts, and then finally you reach this, monstrous red hill that really stood out even then. And so it's distinct from the mining towns of Mexico. It's distinct from the mining towns of other parts of Peru, in that the Cerro Rico took on a kind of truly iconic, we throw that word around a lot, iconic, but I think in this case it really works. The shape of the mountain, the city at its base, it was a sight to behold. Everybody described it as stunning and punishing. Yes, please.
I remember reading about, actually it was a graduate student at Tulane, or a PhD at Tulane, David Dressing, who did his dissertation on Potosí, and I can remember him talking a little bit about the Corral de Comedias, the theater, the public theater.
Right.
And I was wondering if, unfortunately, I don't think he ever published his dissertation on Potosí. But I was wondering if that comes up in the sources that you've published, that you've worked with.
Yes, very good question. The Corral de Comedias, basically Shakespeare-era theater, built around 1610, probably earlier, but that was when it was formalized. And David Dressing's dissertation has not been published, but I cite it heavily. It is a fantastic dissertation. He was one of the first people I went to when I found that document in the New York Public Library, as I had just gotten to Tulane, and I said, David, I've got this document, and it's so amazing. I know you must have seen it or heard about it. And he said, no, I don't know anything about it. I was like, well, then include it in your book. So we actually waited, thinking that he was going to incorporate it, but he was very shy about publishing, and unfortunately wasn't able to do that. But the theater district, or the theater scene, shows up in all kinds of disputes, including in these ones, where it's a place that knife fights break out, and it's also a place for feminine display of wealth in the form of servants and attire and everything else. And it's a semi-secular, semi-religious kind of place too. So not all the theater is strictly fun and games, but Lope de Vega is in the air.
Thank you.
I have a question here from the remote audience. The first one is from Marcos Hildemaro Alarcón Olivos, and he asks the following. How did Spaniards understood civil war back then? The term was widely used in the 5030s and 5040s to describe the conflict between Pizarro and Almagro supporters. What was its meaning in Upper Peru in the 1620s, in the middle of this conflict?
Excellent question, thank you. Civil war, guerra civil, is in our minds connected to strife within a nation state split into two polarized halves. But in this period, it had a less specific meaning, and I would say an elastic meaning. In the first instance, it was factional disputes between families, Hatfields and McCoys. Or for those of you movie buffs, the Rojas and the Baxters in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. That's a kind of civil war that was familiar to Spanish readers and Italian readers. They would expect their Ghibellines and I'm forgetting the others, Guelphs, the Guelphs and Ghibellines. And in the case of Spain, there were multiple versions of this in Granada and other cities. And early visitors to Potosí in the early 17th century, in the 1620s, would say, well, there's that kind of civil war there already. That is, there are these factions, family factions. But what happens with the Basques and Vicuñas is a broader conflict that pits essentially an ethnic minority that speaks its own language, the Basque minority, against virtually everybody else. And it's a question of who will defend them against these others. And so the term is, by the Basques, used to show, no, we're being marked for annihilation, and we're trying to fight back, and we need the crown on our side in order to defend ourselves as good subjects, as faithful subjects, as taxpayers, as people who participate in military affairs and religious affairs and so on. So it's a test of royal justice, and the absence of royal authority allows this civil war to carry on. Yes.
Yeah, so my question is about, you're referring to Potosí as this machine, right, that sits at a high altitude, and all the things that you need to live have to come in from somewhere else. And so I was curious, in the context of this fighting in the streets and houses burning down, what happens to those supply chains? Are there shortages? Are there blockades? Are people who maybe aren't directly involved in the fighting starting to get concerned about its wider effects?
Yes, great question. In fact, that was the first question I asked. Like, what was day-to-day life like? Was it really affected? Were sales affected? Were people interfering with the day-to-day operations of the mines and mills? The short answer is, surprisingly, business carried on. And I found this mostly through notary records. So in the book, I spend the final chapter talking about more or less day-to-day exchanges, as far as I can tell from the 1620s notary books that have survived, plus the royal treasury records that show that silver kept being produced. So certain Basques were being pushed aside, but the mines were actually booming, and there were not the mines themselves, but the mills were functioning. And so it doesn't cause a crisis. It causes a crisis in the mint. For some reason, mint production is interfered with in the last years of this conflict, and I don't have a description why that happened. But as far as I can tell, people went on. They just carried on. It's like, oh yeah, they're murdering each other in the streets again. How much is this? They just went about their daily business. And indigenous people, we have very few viewpoints from indigenous people, enslaved Africans who are at the margins of this. And they seem to take the same sort of position, like, well, you know, this is something among the Castilians or whatever. I don't know what they're fighting about. And we just have to go on with our daily lives. And so surprisingly, it seems not to upset the apple cart. The flood in 1626 does. That actually shuts everything down for a little while.
Thank you. It's a fascinating presentation. I look forward to reading the book. Who were the miners? I mean, who's sort of going down into the mine? Are these locals? Are these imported laborers? Mix?
Yes, very few Spaniards, very few people from the peninsula other than what are called mineros. And the mineros are, in fact, overseers of the mines. Some of them had gained experience as prospectors. Some of them were able administrators, but they were working for higher-ups. The azogueros, typically, the men who owned the mills, would have a minero on staff, or 2 or 3. And then the work itself would be done almost entirely by a mix of free and drafted indigenous workers, Andeans speaking Quechua, Aymara, or both. And they were drafted from this great hinterland. But some also stayed. And so when I say there's a blend of free and forced labor, it's by this time close to 50-50, where you have Mita workers doing the carrying of the heavy ore out of the mine, but the men who are at the face cutting into the wall with iron and steel tools, those are mostly skilled paid laborers because they knew how to pursue veins more with better luck. They knew what to look for. And so there's a mix of skilled and you could say unskilled or semi-skilled work, but almost all of it indigenous. And those few Spaniards who went into the mines and described it would say, not only is this a hellish world, it's completely unintelligible to me because everyone's speaking Quechua or Aymara. I don't know what they're talking about. They have their own vocabulary, for the tools, for the types of ore. They have their own rituals. So there's a mining culture underground. I think it's safe to say that Potosí is distinct in that way too, and that there's no other place on earth that I know of that has so many people underground all the time, right next to the city. So there's this anthill with thousands, literally thousands of people underground, and they're also working through the night. They work shifts, day and night, and there's nothing quite like that. But it's punishing labor, no doubt.
Who held the claims in terms of, did the prospectors come in? Who held production? And I guess the Spanish took most of the economic benefit, but how did it stay in Potosí, and how did wealth get transformed there, with most of it actually being taken by, I guess, the crown, correct?
Right, yeah, so you have, it's a complex question because the crown theoretically owned all subsoil wealth. Like most modern nation states make a similar claim that the state, that's the domain of the state. And then someone who wants to prospect for it can make a claim if they can prove that they have encountered something valuable underground. But then the limits would be on how many yards or what space, how would that be carved up for you. And Spanish mining law develops very quickly. Spanish Indies, in fact, Solórzano Pereira devotes a whole lot of time and space to this because it's an important thing, and there's a ton of litigation. Who owns a claim? How many claims can you have? If it's not active, do you lose it? How many workers do you need to keep it? So indigenous people, enslaved Africans, free people of color can make claims, and they often do, but they can't hang on to them because they don't have access to enough labor to keep the claim. And so they sometimes will make the claim and then sell out to somebody else, usually a Spaniard, who then would try to pass it down through the family. The money that would be made would accrue to the mine owner, the mill owner, and a fifth, 20%, would go to the crown, at least in theory. And the crown also supplied subsidized mercury, which enabled the refiners to produce a significant amount of silver that they wouldn't have been able to do without that subsidy. So they get a labor subsidy, the mita, if you're on the list. Like if you're one of the privileged few, you get a labor subsidy, cheap mercury, and potential tax incentives in order to get going. So there's it's a private-public blend in the sense that the crown is very much in the business, but most of the risk, in fact, the lion's share of the risk, is shouldered by local elites.
Similar to basically modern times.
Very similar. Yes, it looks very familiar.
Got the microphone right here. what did you discover about the mystery book at the New York Public Library that they didn't know they had? What was the provenance? Was it part of a particular collection that made sense, or?
All we could find out is that it was purchased at auction in London from Quaritch booksellers in 1936. 1936. And so relatively recent. And who bought it and under what circumstances, or who donated it, still is a mystery. And but it was one of those things that probably someone was going to type up that card and they got sick that day and forgot about it, and the book went on the shelf. I don't know, but it's the serendipity of the research library. I'm sure that never happens at the John Carter Brown Library because everything is cataloged. But it was a great surprise.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We can thank Kris and keep asking him questions while letting him sip a little bit of wine together with us. Stay, please, for half an hour, 40 minutes in the library. Thank you for coming. Thank you.